The first blush of dawn was painting the sky above the vibrant arteries of Argentus city, its nascent light splintering against the towering spires of mirrored glass that pierced the heavens. Below, a river of morning commuters flowed along the sidewalks, their footsteps a crisp staccato in the cool air, a rhythm punctuated by the blare of horns and the melodic calls of street vendors. Amid this kinetic urban energy, nestled between avant-garde cafes and opulent storefronts, stood a bastion of curated perfection, an establishment that breathed an air of near-mythical exclusivity. Its name, Éclat, was etched in gleaming gold upon a slab of polished obsidian, a word that whispered of prestige and a world just beyond reach. Inside this sanctuary, a deliberate hush stood in stark opposition to the city's frantic pulse. Polished marble floors unfurled like frozen lakes, mirroring the fractured light of 100 crystal prisms dangling from the ceiling. A curated fragrance of amber and rare blossoms hung in the air, an invisible, intentional signature of immense wealth. Mannequins, sculpted like silent deities, were draped in fabrics that could easily finance a lifetime of dreams. The staff glided through the space, each movement a study in practiced elegance, their voices softened to a reverent murmur. This was not a place for idle browsing, you understand. It was a temple erected for the titans of finance and fame, a shrine to the art of acquisition. Near the grand entrance, two sales associates stood poised behind a glass altar, displaying jewels that glittered with captured starlight. Their bespoke uniforms and immaculate grooming broadcast a studied air of superiority. One, a man with sharp features in his early 30s, inclined his head toward his colleague, his voice a conspiratorial whisper designed to maintain the illusion of professional decorum. "Did you catch a glimpse of the new arrival? That sapphire pochette is simply divine," he breathed, his words dripping with a well-rehearsed passion. "Only 3 exist in the entire world," his counterpart replied, a smirk playing on her lips. "I've already secured 2 private viewings. Can you fathom, just for a moment, someone simply wandering in off the street and daring to ask for it?" They shared a low, conspiratorial laugh, the kind reserved for those who believe they are the gatekeepers of a world others can only dream of. The boutique's door chimed, a soft, melodic sound that cut through their private amusement. Heads swiveled, an instinct honed by the anticipation of their elite clientele. The figure who stepped across the threshold, however, was not the one they expected. She was dressed in a simple cashmere cardigan of softest dove gray, worn over a crisp white shirt, paired with well-tailored denim and unassuming loafers. Her dark hair was gathered in an elegant but unfussy knot, and her only adornment was a supple leather satchel slung casually over her shoulder. Evelina Reese had entered this gilded cage seeking a simple token of affection, a gift. The celebrated philanthropist and author moved with an understated grace, her very presence a quiet force that drew the eye despite her simple attire. She surveyed the opulent displays with the same focused and thoughtful gaze she applied to everything in her life. Yet instead of the effusive welcome one might anticipate, she was met with an almost tangible frostiness. The man behind the counter, the one from the earlier conversation, felt his eyes narrow almost imperceptibly, his instant judgment hidden behind a mask of practiced civility. To his discerning eye, she was a jarring note in a perfectly composed symphony, a woman who simply did not belong. He exchanged a fleeting, meaningful glance with his colleague before moving to intercept her, his smile as polished and cold as the marble beneath his feet. "Good morning," he began, his voice smooth as silk, yet with a razor's edge concealed within its folds. "May I be of assistance to you today?" Evelina offered a warm, genuine smile, either oblivious to or choosing to rise above the subtle condescension lacing his tone. "Good morning. I'm searching for a rather special gift, something with both elegance and meaning. A handbag, perhaps? Or a piece of jewelry?" The associate's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, his gaze dropping to her practical footwear before snapping back to her face. "Of course," he purred, the smile tightening at the corners. "Our collection is quite particular. Most of our creations are singular. Might I inquire as to the kind of investment you have in mind for this acquisition?" The question, though cloaked in politeness, hung in the air, heavy with unspoken doubt. Evelina's gracious expression did not waver, but a knowing light flickered in her eyes, a silent acknowledgment of a barrier she had encountered in countless forms throughout her life. "I believe I'd prefer to appreciate the collection first," she replied, her voice a calm and steady current. "After that, we can certainly discuss the specifics." "Of course," the man echoed, his tone shifting from polite to patronizing. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the main showroom with a theatrical flourish. As she glided past, he shot a look back at his colleague, who responded with a single perfectly arched eyebrow. Evelina began to peruse the displays, her eyes moving with authentic admiration over the artistry before her. She paused before a vitrine of handbags, each a masterpiece of design. One in particular captured her gaze, a structured piece in a deep forest green, accented with brushed gold hardware. It was bold yet classic, the kind of object that commanded attention without demanding it. "This one," she said, her voice clear as she indicated the bag. "Might I have a closer look?" The associate who had first greeted her moved forward, his actions deliberate and slow. He unlocked the case with a small ornate key and reverently lifted the bag, placing it upon the counter. As he did, another employee appeared, a woman with severe cheekbones and a tablet clutched in her hand. She gave Evelina a swift, dismissive scan before murmuring something to her colleague. "Ah," the man said, his tone now imbued with a new layer of warning. "I must inform you this particular creation is from our atelier's most exclusive, limited edition line. Its price is set at $85,000. He let the number hang in the charged air, a clear challenge, perhaps expecting her to flinch or stammer. Instead, she simply tilted her head, her calm unwavering. "It is exquisite," she stated. "What more can you share with me about it?" The man paused, momentarily thrown by her composure. Before he could formulate a response, the woman with the tablet stepped in. "It is a piece favored by our most established patrons," she interjected, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that failed to conceal its insincerity. "We typically hold such items for private appointments. Were you referred to us by one of our clients?" Evelina turned to face her, her gaze direct and unblinking. "No," she answered simply. "I walked in." The woman's smile wavered, a crack in her polished facade, before she quickly repaired it. "I see," she said, her tone cooling several degrees. "Well, we are delighted to assist you. Simply be aware that our pieces are in high demand, and our patrons generally prefer to conclude their acquisitions without delay." There it was again. The veiled assumption, the quiet dismissal dressed in the fine clothes of customer service. Evelina felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest, a potent mix of frustration and rising resolve. She was here for a simple, joyful purpose, and instead she was being subjected to a subtle interrogation, her worthiness judged by individuals who knew nothing of who she was. As the interaction unfolded, she became acutely aware of the furtive glances exchanged among the staff, the hushed whispers that died just as she turned. This was not the first time she had been underestimated, but the sting of it never truly faded. She drew a slow, centering breath, recalling the lessons her parents had taught her. Dignity in the face of indignity, grace under fire. For now she would let it pass, but a deep instinct told her this quiet battle was far from finished. The chapter closes with Evelina moving deeper into the heart of the boutique, entirely unaware that the simmering tension around her was about to boil over into a confrontation that would be anything but quiet. Evelina continued her serene exploration of the boutique, her gaze drifting over the flawlessly curated displays. Each object, from the constellations of diamond necklaces to the butter-soft leather of the handbags, seemed to vibrate with a singular command: admire, desire, but do not touch unless you belong. The air itself felt thick with an unwritten law. Everything here was designed to inspire awe, and if not awe, then intimidation. Yet as she moved among the gleaming glass cases, the atmosphere grew heavier, the sense of being watched more acute. The sales staff were observing her now, their scrutiny barely concealed behind polite smiles and staged conversations. She paused by a display of silk scarves, her fingertips brushing against the exquisite fabric of a hand-painted piece alive with vibrant color. The texture was sublime, the artistry breathtaking. Evelina took a moment to appreciate the craftsmanship, then glanced up just in time to see one associate murmur to another. They both shot a look in her direction, shared a nearly imperceptible smirk, and then pivoted away, feigning interest in arranging a nearby display. Her own smile tightened at the edges, but she held her composure. A lifetime in the public eye had forged in her an unshakable poise, and she would not let it crack now. Still, their shared moment of derision lingered in her mind, a discordant note in the boutique's symphony of false reverence. She drifted back toward the counter, where the magnificent green handbag rested like a jewel on velvet, its gold clasp catching the soft light. The male associate, her initial greeter, materialized at her side once more. His smile was a masterpiece of practiced charm, but his eyes were cold, holding a clear and unmistakable verdict. He gestured to the handbag with a grandiose sweep of his hand, as if unveiling a crown jewel. "Have you reached a decision, madam?" he inquired, his tone a slick veneer of courtesy. "It is a singular piece, truly unlike any other." "It is lovely," Evelina affirmed, her voice perfectly even. "Could you elaborate on its design? The specific techniques used in its creation?" The man paused for a heartbeat, visibly caught off guard by her genuine interest in the finer details. "Well," he stammered, recovering quickly, "it is meticulously handcrafted in Florence. The leather is sourced from a generational tannery, a family that has perfected its art for over 2 centuries. The gold hardware is, of course, exclusive to our house." "I am sure it is," Evelina finished for him, her tone neutral but her gaze sharp, watching as he grew visibly uncomfortable under her steady scrutiny. "Precisely," he said, regaining his footing. "We reserve such pieces for clientele who can truly grasp their inherent value. May I ask if you intend to finalize this acquisition today?" Evelina noted the slight, deliberate emphasis on the word today, a subtle challenge implying her interest was mere fantasy. Before she could form a reply, the female associate with the tablet glided toward them, the soft click of her heels on the marble floor announcing her arrival. Her expression was one of polite concern, the kind one might affect when dealing with a charming but confused child. "Excuse me," the woman began, glancing at her colleague before fixing her gaze on Evelina. "I simply wish to ensure you are familiar with our boutique's policies. Items from this particular collection are held for clients with established acquisition histories. It is a measure that helps us protect the integrity of our brand." The words were delivered with a disarming smile, but their message was a steel door slamming shut. Evelina felt the heat in her chest intensify, yet she forced herself to remain calm, to meet the woman's gaze without flinching. "I see," Evelina said, her voice deliberate and slow. "And what precisely constitutes an established acquisition history?" The woman hesitated, clearly not expecting to be questioned. "It is merely a way to confirm that our patrons are aligned with the values and standards of our brand," she said, her voice becoming slightly more strained. Evelina's composed exterior remained flawless, but a storm of frustration was gathering within her. She had endured countless microaggressions in her life, subtle and overt acts of prejudice, but each new instance was a fresh wound. She thought of the young people she mentored, the stories they shared of being dismissed and devalued based on their appearance or their zip code. This moment, she knew, was a reflection of that same painful reality. "I would like to see the bag one more time," she said, her voice now firm, "if it is not too much of an inconvenience." The male associate, now visibly tense, exchanged a nervous glance with the woman before reaching for the handbag. He placed it back on the counter, his movements overly ginger and careful, as if he feared her very presence might tarnish it. Evelina examined the bag again, her fingers tracing the flawless stitching along its seams. She was no longer thinking about its price or its purpose. What mattered now was the principle. What mattered was refusing to be made small. She turned to the man, her expression serene but resolute. "I will take it," she declared. The two words fell into the hushed atmosphere, instantly silencing the low hum of activity in the boutique. The male associate blinked, stunned into silence. The woman with the tablet arched a disbelieving eyebrow, her mask of civility slipping for a fraction of a second. "Of course," the man managed, forcing a smile. Allow me to prepare the necessary documentation for you. He turned and walked toward a back counter, but Evelina could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her, a physical force. The whispers resumed, quiet and sharp, and this time she caught the fragments. "Is she for real?" one voice hissed. "She can't possibly afford that," another replied. Evelina's jaw clenched. Her patience was wearing dangerously thin. She had come here seeking a moment of simple beauty, a gift, and in return she was being dissected, judged, and ridiculed. The associate returned, holding a tablet with a form displayed on the screen. "If you could just provide us with some details," he said, his tone cloyingly sweet. "We will also require a credit verification before we can finalize an acquisition of this magnitude." Evelina stared at him, her expression hardening. A credit verification. In all her years, she had never been met with such a demeaning demand. It was a profound insult, thinly disguised as procedure. "I do not believe that will be necessary," she said, her voice like ice. The man hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Before he could respond, the woman with the tablet stepped forward once more, her voice dripping with false concern. "We simply wish to ensure a seamless transaction," she cooed. "You understand, I am sure." Evelina's composure finally fractured, though only her voice betrayed it. It remained quiet, but it was now lined with steel. "What I understand," she said, "is that you have made a judgment about me based on nothing more than my appearance. That is not policy. That is prejudice." The woman's mouth opened to object, but no sound emerged. For a moment, the tension in the room was a tangible thing, thick and suffocating. Then the male associate cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Perhaps we should—" he started, but Evelina cut him off. "I believe I have seen enough," she said, her shoulders straightening as she drew herself up to her full height. She turned on her heel and began to walk toward the exit, her steps measured and powerful. Behind her, the whispers escalated, but she did not look back. As the boutique's heavy door swung closed behind her, the cool city air rushed over her, a welcome balm. But the sting of their judgment remained, sharp and bitter. She paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. This was not over, not by a long shot. The streets of Argentus City thrummed with their usual chaotic symphony, the ceaseless hum of traffic and the distant cries of vendors creating a vibrant score that stood in sharp contrast to the sterile quiet she had just escaped. Evelina stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, gathering the scattered pieces of her composure, attempting to quell the tempest of emotions churning within her. She had faced down global leaders, endured the unrelenting glare of public scrutiny. Yet there was something uniquely poisonous about this kind of casual, socially acceptable prejudice that felt like a personal violation. She took another deep, cleansing breath, the cool air a shock to her system, and then, with a newfound resolve, she turned and pushed back through the boutique's doors. The soft chime announced her return, and several heads snapped in her direction. The sales associates, some of whom had been snickering only moments before, froze in their tasks. Their eyes tracked her movements, their expressions a cocktail of confusion, surprise, and for some, outright annoyance. Evelina moved with a quiet power, her head held high, her gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto the male associate who had been her primary tormentor. He appeared momentarily paralyzed by her reappearance, his eyes widening before he could plaster on his practiced smile. He began to move toward her, but before he could utter a word, Evelina spoke, her voice resonating across the hushed space, firm and undeniable. "I wish to speak with the manager," she stated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The male associate faltered, the color draining from his face. He cast a nervous glance toward the back of the store, where the woman with the tablet stood watching, her own expression a mask of stone. The woman glided forward, her heels clicking in aggressive rhythm against the marble. Her posture was rigid. "Is there a problem?" she inquired, her voice a carefully calibrated neutral. Evelina turned to meet her gaze, unflinching. "Yes, there is a problem. The manner in which I was treated in your establishment today was utterly unacceptable. I came here with the intent to make a significant purchase, and instead, I was met with a level of suspicion and disrespect that is shocking in any setting, let alone one that purports to value its clientele." The woman blinked, clearly thrown by Evelina's directness. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally among her colleagues. Several other associates had ceased all pretense of work, their full attention now fixed on the unfolding drama. The air grew thick, the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. "I can assure you, madam, we have protocols in place to ensure all of our clients receive the highest level of service," the woman began, her voice strained. "We must uphold certain standards." Evelina cut her off, her voice calm but sharp as a shard of glass. "Standards? Are these standards that include making snap judgments about people based on how they are dressed? Tell me, what was it about my appearance that suggested I was not worthy of your respect?" The female associate opened her mouth, then closed it again, no words coming to her aid. Her carefully constructed professional armor seemed to be shattering under Evelina's steady, unwavering stare. She looked to her male colleague, who had taken several cautious steps backward, as if to physically distance himself from the confrontation. "Perhaps it would be best if you left," the woman finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Evelina raised an eyebrow, a small, incredulous smile touching her lips. "You want me to leave?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. She took a step closer, her presence seeming to expand, to fill the vast space. "Is this your solution when your staff mistreats a customer? You ask the person who was wrong to leave?" The woman flinched at the accusation, her composure crumbling further. She glanced around, her discomfort palpable, her eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. But no one moved. The rest of the staff were frozen, trapped between morbid curiosity and the fear of getting involved. The male associate finally found his voice and stepped forward. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his tone tight with anxiety. "We have other clients to attend to, and this is not the sort of atmosphere we wish to cultivate." Evelina let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound filled with both disbelief and profound frustration. "You think I'm the one creating a scene?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "All I wished to do was purchase a gift. Instead, I was made to feel like an intruder, like I was not good enough to even breathe the air in this place." The male associate shifted on his feet, his eyes flickering toward the other customers who were now watching with undisguised interest, some with raised eyebrows, others whispering behind their hands. The female associate cleared her throat, making a desperate attempt to seize control. "Ma'am, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," she declared, though her voice trembled. Evelina shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "That's not what this is about, and you know it. You didn't refuse me service because I was disruptive. You refused me service because of your own baseless assumptions, because I don't conform to your narrow idea of what a valuable client looks like." The tension in the room was now electric, the silence stretching into an eternity. Finally, something within the female associate seemed to snap. Her face flushed with a volatile mixture of anger and humiliation. She took a step forward, her voice rising. "Please leave, ma'am. We don't need this kind of spectacle here," she commanded, her tone harsh. Evelina looked at her, her eyes filled with a calm defiance that seemed to unnerve the woman even more. She held her gaze for a long, silent moment before finally giving a slow nod, her lips curving into a tight, mirthless smile. "Fine," she said, her voice low but carrying an immense weight. "But understand this is not over. You cannot continue to treat people this way and expect there to be no consequences. The world is watching, and people deserve to know how they will be judged when they walk through your doors." With that final pronouncement, she turned on her heel, her stride powerful and deliberate as she moved toward the exit. The atmosphere behind her seemed to crackle with the force of her departure, the tension almost suffocating. As she reached the door, she glanced back over her shoulder, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the stunned faces of the staff and the wide-eyed, curious expressions of the other patrons. Without another word, she pushed the door open, the chime ringing out softly as she stepped back into the living, breathing city of Argentus. The cool air rushed to greet her, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere she had just left behind. She paused, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor inside her. The pain and frustration were familiar companions, But their familiarity did not lessen their sting. She had faced prejudice before, more times than she could count, but the casual cruelty of being dismissed and judged so thoughtlessly still left a bitter residue. The encounter had stripped away the armor of composure she had worked so hard to build, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She knew this was not just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than, because of their appearance, their background, their skin color. It was about the systemic prejudice that was woven into the very DNA of places like that boutique, places that hid their ugliness behind a facade of elegance and prestige, fostering an environment not of exclusivity, but of exclusion. Evelina opened her eyes, her gaze sharpening as it focused on the bustling street before her. She saw people moving with purpose, living their lives, unaware of the storm that had just broken inside her. But she would not let this moment fade into silence. This time, she would use her voice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been treated in the same way. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that demanded to be confronted. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she composed a message to a trusted contact, someone she knew she could rely on. She possessed the platform to bring attention to this, to shine a blinding light on the kind of insidious treatment that so many people endured, but rarely had the power to challenge. And she was determined to do just that. As she began to walk, her steps now filled with purpose, she could feel a new resolve solidifying within her. This would not be another silent indignity swallowed and forgotten. She had the power to make a difference, and she would not let this opportunity pass her by. The boutique's pristine facade might remain unchanged for now, but the truth of what festered beneath it was about to be laid bare for all the world to see. This was only the beginning. That evening, long after the heavy doors of Éclat had shut behind her, Evelina sat in her living room, the comforting quiet of her own home doing little to soothe the turbulent emotions within. She watched the flames dance in the hearth, their soft glow doing nothing to dispel the shadows of the day's events. Her mind replayed the cutting words of the boutique staff, the disdain in their eyes, the condescending tones, the final humiliating dismissal. This was a kind of pain she had hoped to leave in the past, a familiar specter from her youth, one that she knew still haunted too many people every single day. The fading evening light streamed through the tall windows, casting long, somber shadows across the room, and Evelina knew she could not simply let the day's ugliness fade with the light. She now had the influence, the voice, and the platform to force a reckoning, to expose the insidious prejudice that thrived in places meant to be paragons of luxury. With this clarity of purpose, she picked up her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she typed a message to her closest ally, her partner and confidant, Liam. "Had a truly awful experience today," she wrote. "Went to buy a gift and instead received a stark reminder of what some people believe I deserve." The reply was almost instantaneous, as she knew it would be. Liam had a unique gift for offering support without question, for understanding without needing an explanation. His message was simple, but it carried the weight of all they had faced together. "Let's talk tonight. Whatever you decide to do, I am with you." A faint smile touched her lips, and she felt a small measure of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. They talked late into the night, long after the house fell silent and the city lights twinkled outside. She recounted every detail, every sneer, every dismissive glance. She spoke of the profound indignity of being asked for a credit verification, as if she were a common thief instead of a customer. Liam listened intently, his brow furrowed in shared frustration, but his voice, when he spoke, was a calm and steady anchor. "You cannot let this go, Ev," he said, taking her hand in his. "You have the power to ensure this doesn't just become another forgotten story of someone being mistreated because of who they are. We can shine a light on this." Evelina nodded, her determination hardening into unshakable resolve. He was right. She had always believed that silence was a form of complicity, that true change only came when people found the courage to speak their truth. This was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel unworthy, every soul who had ever faced prejudice hidden behind a polished smile. The following day, Evelina began to make calls. She reached out to a small circle of trusted contacts, journalists and activists who understood the power of narrative to expose injustice. She shared her experience, and to her immense relief, they immediately grasped what was at stake. They discussed the power of visibility, how shining a spotlight on even a seemingly small act of prejudice could create ripples that would lead to a tidal wave of change. "We should make a statement," one of the journalists suggested. "Go back there. Let the cameras capture it, not just your story, but the larger truth of how these places operate." It was a bold strategy, and Evelina knew it carried risks. There would be critics who would accuse her of creating drama, of using her position to draw attention to herself. But she also knew there were countless others who would see their own painful experiences reflected in hers, who would feel validated and heard because of her actions. And that was more than enough reason to proceed. The plan came together with remarkable speed. The journalists organized a small discreet camera crew, and Evelina prepared herself. She was returning to Éclat, not as a slighted customer, but as a representative for every person who had ever been treated as less than. On the morning of her return, the sky over the city was a heavy blanket of gray, mirroring her own somber but resolute mood. Evelina dressed with intention, choosing a simple yet elegant dress that radiated confidence without shouting wealth. She wanted her presence to be the statement, not her attire. The drive to the boutique was quiet, the journalists in the car with her speaking in hushed, strategic tones. Evelina listened, nodding at intervals, but her mind was with the young people who would see this, the ones who faced this kind of quiet degradation every day without a platform to fight back. This was for them. The boutique loomed ahead, its gleaming facade reflecting the muted sky. Evelina took a deep, steadying breath, her fingers tightening on the handle of her handbag as she stepped from the car. The camera crew moved into position, and she saw the surprised looks on the faces of passers-by as they recognized her, many pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding event. She paid them no mind, her focus entirely on the task ahead. The door chimed softly as she entered, the same sound as before, but this time the air was different. The same marble floors, the same opulent displays. But now a new tension crackled in the atmosphere. The sales associates looked up, their eyes widening in collective shock as they saw her. A few exchanged nervous, panicked glances, utterly unprepared for this. The female associate with the tablet was the first to recover, stepping forward with her expression carefully arranged into a neutral mask. "Good morning," she said, her voice strained. "How can we help you today?" Evelina met her gaze, her own voice calm but carrying an authority that resonated throughout the room. "I'm here to talk about what happened yesterday. I believe it's important for people to see how you treat potential customers who don't fit your preconceived notions." The woman blinked, her composure faltering for a moment before she forced a brittle smile. "I'm not certain what you're referring to," she said, her tone defensive. "We treat all of our customers with the utmost respect." "Do you?" Evelina countered, her voice unwavering. She gestured toward the cameras, which had moved closer, capturing every nuance. "Because what I experienced here yesterday was the furthest thing from respect. I was judged, dismissed, and ultimately asked to leave, not because of anything I did, but because of how I looked." The woman's eyes darted toward the cameras, her discomfort now painfully obvious. She glanced at her colleagues, who were frozen behind the counters, their expressions a mixture of confusion and fear. One of the male associates, the one who had served her the day before, took a hesitant step forward, his face ashen. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice weak. "You were only trying to uphold your brand's standards," Evelina finished for him, her tone sharp. "But let's be very clear. Those standards are rooted in prejudice. You judged me because I did not fit your idea of a worthy client, and I am here today to ensure that everyone knows it." A heavy silence descended upon the room, thick and suffocating. The female associate looked as if she wished the marble floor would swallow her whole, her face flushing a deep crimson as she struggled for a response. The male associate's gaze fell to the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Evelina turned to the cameras, her voice steady. her words deliberate and powerful. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who has ever walked into a store like this and been made to feel unwelcome and unworthy. It's about the quiet prejudice that festers in these places, the kind that people rarely see but that affects so many of us. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the staff and the curious onlookers who had gathered outside the boutique's windows. I hope that by being here today, by speaking out, we can begin to change that. Because everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. With those final words, Evelina turned and walked toward the exit, the cameras following her every step. She could hear the stunned murmurs behind her, but she did not look back. This was not about a personal vendetta. It was about illuminating a darkness that needed to be seen. Outside, the crowd had swelled, people lining the sidewalk with their phones held high, recording. Evelina paused for a moment, turning to face them, her expression calm and resolute. "Change begins with us," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd's murmur. "It begins with speaking up, with refusing to accept things as they are. We have to demand better. From our businesses, from each other, and from ourselves." The crowd was silent for a beat, and then a ripple of applause started, growing in volume and intensity until it filled the street. Evelina smiled, a true, radiant smile this time. She gave a small nod, then turned and made her way to the car, the sound of the applause following her, an echo of hope as she left the boutique and its prejudice behind. This was just the beginning. The air felt charged as Evelina sat quietly in the car on her way to the boutique, replaying the plans in her mind. This time she wasn't alone. The small convoy of cars behind her carried a television crew, journalists and activists, people who understood the stakes, people who understood the power of visibility. This was not just a simple confrontation. It was a chance to shine a light on a problem that went deeper than a single incident. The gray sky hung heavy over Argentis City as they approached the familiar building. The boutique, with its polished facade and luxurious displays, appeared almost innocuous on the bustling street, another symbol of the exclusive world it catered to. But Evelina knew better. She knew what lay beneath the glamorous veneer, a culture that dismissed, judged, and discriminated against those who didn't fit an arbitrary mold. As her car pulled up, the journalists began setting up. The camera crew assembled quickly and efficiently, understanding the gravity of the situation. Evelina stepped out of the vehicle, her expression serious but calm, her dress understated but elegant. She wanted to look like herself, like the woman who had once advised world leaders, but also like the woman who knew the streets of a forgotten neighborhood, who understood firsthand what it meant to be underestimated. There was a quiet murmur among the people gathered nearby, some bystanders, some passers-by who had paused, curious about the cameras and the small group assembling in front of the boutique. She noticed a few people pull out their phones, their faces a mix of surprise and anticipation. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing across the notes she had prepared, though she knew she wouldn't need them. This confrontation had been living in her mind for the past day, playing out over and over. As she walked to the door, the soft chime echoed just as it had the day before, but this time the tension was different. Charged, deliberate. The boutique's pristine interior seemed to shrink under the intensity of the moment, the air growing thick with apprehension. Evelina walked in, flanked by journalists, the cameras rolling, capturing every moment. She saw the staff freeze in their places, recognizing her immediately. Their eyes widened, and they exchanged anxious glances as they realized what was happening. This was not the discreet visit of a single customer. It was something much bigger. The woman with the tablet, the same one who had dismissed her with veiled politeness the day before, stepped forward, her eyes darting from Evelina to the cameras, a hint of panic in her expression. "Good morning, ma'am," she said, her voice uncertain, the rehearsed professionalism now shaky. "How can we assist you today?" Evelina faced her, her expression resolute, her voice carrying authority without raising it. "I'm here today to talk about the way your staff treated me yesterday. I think it's important that people see how businesses like yours operate, how you treat customers who might not fit your preconceived ideas of who deserves respect." The woman's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Ma'am, we strive to provide excellent service to all of our customers," she began, her tone defensive as she glanced nervously at the cameras. "There must have been some misunderstanding." Evelina shook her head slowly. "No, there was no misunderstanding. Yesterday, I came in here as a potential customer, just like anyone else. I was ignored, belittled, and ultimately asked to leave, all because you decided I didn't belong here. Not because of my behavior, but because of my appearance." The boutique seemed to grow smaller as silence fell across the room, the words hanging heavily in the air. Several other associates were standing by, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright alarm. The male associate, the one who had spoken to her yesterday, stepped forward, hesitant, his gaze flickering between Evelina and the cameras. "We didn't mean to—" "It wasn't like that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. We have policies, you see." "Policies?" Evelina interrupted, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Policies that determine who gets treated with dignity and who doesn't? Is that what you mean by policies?" The male associate looked down, his face turning pale. The woman with the tablet took a step back, clearly wanting to extricate herself from the situation but unable to. One of the journalists moved forward, her camera focused on Evelina, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mrs. Reese, could you clarify what you believe the issue to be here? For the viewers at home, what message are you hoping to send today?" Evelina turned slightly to face the journalist, her gaze unwavering. "The issue here isn't just about me. What happened to me yesterday is a reflection of a larger problem, a systemic issue that affects people all across this country. It's about the quiet, pervasive prejudice that's still present in our society, the kind that tells people they're not good enough based on nothing more than how they look or what they're wearing. It's about exclusivity that's used as a shield for discrimination." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the boutique, taking in the stunned, uneasy faces of the staff. Places like this present themselves as temples of luxury, open only to a chosen few, and they get to decide who's worthy of entering those doors. Yesterday, I was told, indirectly, but clearly, that I was not one of those people. And I know I'm not alone in that experience. There was a ripple of murmurs among the bystanders, the journalists scribbling notes, the cameras clicking. The woman with the tablet shifted uncomfortably, her face flushed. She tried to speak, but Evelina didn't give her the chance. "I'm not here for an apology," Evelina said, her voice firm but not harsh. "An apology won't change what happened yesterday. And it won't change what happens in boutiques, restaurants, and other places like this every day. What I want is for people to see this, to understand that the quiet discrimination that people face in spaces like these is real and harmful." She gestured to the camera. "This isn't about making a scene. It's about making sure that people are held accountable. It's about creating spaces where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or the way they look, is treated with respect." The male associate swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room, clearly unsure of how to respond. The woman with the tablet opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. Evelina looked at them, her expression softening slightly. "It's not too late to change. It's not too late to look at the way you do things here, to reconsider the way you see people. Because if places like this want to remain in business, they have to change. People are watching, and they're not going to accept discrimination in any form." She turned her gaze to the cameras, her voice growing softer but no less impactful. "We have a responsibility to call out discrimination when we see it. We have a responsibility to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, with dignity and respect. This is one story, but it's part of a much bigger picture, and it's up to all of us to do better." She held the gaze of the camera for a moment longer, her words resonating in the heavy silence that had fallen over the room. Then she turned, her steps purposeful as she walked toward the door. The journalists moved aside, making way for her, the cameras following her every movement. The soft chime of the door echoed as she stepped out onto the busy Argentus sidewalk. The crowd that had gathered outside was larger now, people standing with their phones raised, capturing the moment. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a mix of applause, cheers, and shouts of support. Evelina paused, turning to face the crowd, her expression calm but resolute. She raised her hand slightly, her voice ringing out clearly. Change starts with all of us. Speak up, stand up, and never accept being treated as less than anyone else. Together, we can make a difference. The applause grew louder, spreading down the street, people clapping, cheering, their faces filled with admiration and respect. Evelina smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. She nodded to the crowd, then turned and walked toward the car, the noise of the crowd following her, echoing down the streets of Argentis. Inside the car, as the door closed behind her, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. She had done what she needed to do, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel as though they didn't belong. It wasn't the end. It was only a step, one of many steps that still needed to be taken. But it was a start, and that was what mattered. The car pulled away from the curb, and Evelina looked out the window at the city, at the people still standing outside the boutique, their faces turned toward her, their voices raised in support. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. That change took time and effort and persistence. But as she watched the crowd, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Because today, people had listened. Today, people had seen. And today, the world felt just a little bit closer to the kind of place it could be, where everyone was treated with the respect they deserved, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. And for Evelina, that was worth everything. The day after her return to the boutique, the footage of Evelina's confrontation was already a tidal wave across social media and news networks. Clips of her standing firm in the boutique, the journalists capturing her pointed questions and her final statement to the crowd outside, were shared across platforms accompanied by hashtags like "Dignity over Design," "Exclusion is not luxury," and "Evelina Speaks." People from every corner of the internet weighed in, some expressing outrage, others offering solidarity, many sharing their own painful stories of similar experiences. The ripple effect was instantaneous. The boutique, which had once basked in its reputation as an exclusive haven for the elite, suddenly found itself at the epicenter of a firestorm of criticism. Articles were written, op-eds were published, all dissecting the incident, the implications of casual discrimination, and the broader issues of systemic bias in the world of high-end consumerism. The boutique's name became synonymous not with luxury, but with exclusion. The boutique's management, realizing they were in a free fall, acted swiftly. By midday, their public relations team had crafted a statement. It was released across all their social media channels and posted on their website. A carefully worded apology addressed directly to Evelina Reese, acknowledging the unfortunate experience she had endured in their store. They pledged to improve staff training, to work towards a more inclusive environment, and to ensure that every customer, regardless of their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. The statement, though impeccably constructed, was met with a wall of skepticism. People in the comments section were quick to label it a shallow attempt at brand preservation, pointing out that true change required more than just a public relations maneuver. Some questioned the sincerity of their promises. Others demanded to see concrete, verifiable action. But the conversation remained focused on the core issue: the chasm between how businesses present themselves and how they treat real people who do not fit their narrow definition of an ideal client. Evelina, meanwhile, sat in her home office, scrolling through the thousands of messages she had received. Her social media accounts were a flood of emotion, a mix of ardent support and vitriolic anger from those who felt she had overstepped. But what resonated most deeply were the messages from people who had walked in her shoes. They wrote about their own experiences, some in luxury stores, others at car dealerships, restaurants, or even hotels. "Thank you for speaking up," one woman had written. "I cannot tell you how many times I've walked into places like that and been made to feel completely invisible. Maybe now they will finally see us." Another message, from a young man, said simply, "I hope one day I have the courage to stand up for myself the way you did. Thank you for being a voice for all of us." Evelina set her phone down, the weight of their words settling in her mind. She knew this was not the end. It was just the beginning of something much larger. The public discourse, the raw, honest conversation that had ignited because of what happened in that boutique. This was what truly mattered. It was never about punishing a single store or forcing an apology. It was about making people aware, about shining a light on the quiet prejudice that so many faced but so few ever talked about. That afternoon, Evelina received a call from a prominent journalist, someone she had worked with before, who understood the mechanics of advocacy. The journalist suggested harnessing this momentum, creating a public forum, a national discussion about discrimination in retail and consumer spaces. Evelina agreed without hesitation, seeing the opportunity to transform this moment of attention into a movement for action. A week later, a virtual town hall was organized. The journalist moderated, and Evelina joined as the keynote guest. The discussion was open to the public, and people from all across the country tuned in. The forum became more than just a rehash of the boutique incident. It evolved into a broader, more profound conversation about systemic prejudice, about the silent, insidious ways discrimination persists in spaces that pride themselves on exclusivity. Evelina shared her story again, but this time she wove in the many stories she had heard from others since the incident. She read aloud some of the messages she had received, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It was a powerful act, giving voice to the real experiences of people who were so often ignored. As the discussion continued, others began to share their own stories in real time. People called in, their voices sometimes trembling as they spoke of times they had been made to feel humiliated, dismissed, unseen. One caller, a middle-aged woman from Dallas, described being ignored in a high-end jewelry store, while the staff fawned over a white customer who had entered after her. Another young man from Miami shared how he had been shadowed by security in a department store, made to feel like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The stories were heartbreaking, but they were also unifying. They illuminated the common threads of experience that connected people, regardless of where they lived or who they were. Evelina listened to each one, nodding, offering words of encouragement, thanking each person for their courage. She spoke about how these were not isolated events. They were part of a larger pattern, one that needed to be dismantled systematically. She emphasized the critical importance of visibility, of refusing to let these moments of indignity pass in silence. "We have to hold people accountable," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "And that begins with sharing our experiences. It begins with refusing to be invisible. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from speaking up, from demanding that we all be treated with the dignity and respect we deserve." The forum lasted for hours, and by the end, Evelina felt an overwhelming sense of both exhaustion and hope. It was emotionally draining to absorb the pain in so many voices, to be reminded of how widespread the problem was. But it was also profoundly hopeful, because people were speaking out. They were sharing their stories, demanding better, refusing to accept the status quo. And that, she knew, was how real change began. In the days that followed, the story continued to grow. More news outlets picked up on the town hall, highlighting the urgent need for systemic change in how luxury retail and other service industries operated. The boutique, now under a microscope of intense public scrutiny, announced a series of new initiatives to address unconscious bias among its staff. They promised to hire diversity consultants and implement new mandatory training programs, steps that, while positive, were largely seen as reactive, a desperate attempt to salvage their tarnished image. But something else began to happen, something far more significant. Other businesses started to take notice. Retailers, restaurant groups, and service providers saw the public's reaction to the boutique's behavior, saw the outcry, and began to reflect on their own practices. Several high-profile luxury brands released statements affirming their commitment to inclusivity, outlining the steps they were taking to ensure that all customers felt welcomed and valued. It was clear that the industry, at least in some small way, was feeling the pressure to change. Evelina watched these developments with a cautious optimism. She knew that statements and training programs were only the first step, that real, lasting change would require a fundamental cultural shift, a re-examination of the very idea of exclusivity that was so often built on the exclusion of others. But she also knew that the conversation had started, that people were finally paying attention, and that was more than she could have ever hoped for when she first walked back into that boutique. Sitting in her office, she began to draft a post for her social media, a message to address the outpouring of support and the broader movement that was taking shape. She wrote about her experience, about the messages she had received, about the town hall, and about the importance of continuing to hold each other accountable. When we speak up, she wrote, we make it harder for prejudice to hide in the shadows. We make it harder for those who would treat others unfairly to do so without consequence. This isn't just about one boutique or one incident. It's about all of us. It's about the world we want to create, the way we want to treat one another. We have to keep demanding better. We have to keep raising our voices. Together we can make a difference. She paused for a moment, rereading the words before hitting post. She watched as the reactions began to pour in. Likes, shares, comments, people adding their voices to the chorus. It was a small action, but it was part of something much larger. It was a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen, one voice at a time, one story at a time. As she leaned back in her chair, a sense of calm settled over her. This wasn't the end. There would be more challenges, more moments of frustration, more battles to fight. But today they had taken a step forward. Today people were listening, and for Evelina that was worth everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. She thought of the young people who had reached out to her, the ones who had said they felt seen because of what she had done. She thought of the people who had bravely shared their stories during the town hall, their voices filled with pain, but also with a fierce hope. Change was never easy. It was slow, often painful, and filled with setbacks. But it was happening. She could feel it, see it in the responses, hear it in the voices of those who had found the courage to speak. And that was enough to keep her moving forward, enough to keep her fighting. For herself, for others, for a world that saw every single person as deserving of respect and dignity. Because at the end of the day, that was what mattered most.